Picture this. You are an ancient woman. It is roughly 50,000 years ago. You live in a band of about 30 people somewhere in what is now sub-Saharan Africa. The sun is coming up. There is a fire to tend, food to forage, children to manage, and about 15 different social dynamics within your group that require constant low-level attention. And this morning, on top of all of that, your period has started. No pharmacy, no pad aisle with 47 confusing options. No tampon, no menstrual cup, no period underwear, no heating pad for the cramps, no painkillers, no chocolate within 100,000 years of existing, no privacy either. You live with 30 people in close quarters, and there are no walls and no doors and no concept of a bathroom in any sense you would recognize. Just you. A very urgent biological situation, and whatever the landscape around you happens to provide. Now here's the question that almost nobody asks when they think about ancient human life, despite it being one of the most universal human experiences that has ever existed. How did ancient women actually manage this? Because here is the thing, and this is the part that changes everything about how you think about this question. The answer is not what you might expect. It involves biology that will make you rethink what periods even are. It involves materials that were clever enough to survive in the archaeological record. It involves a complete rethinking of how often ancient women were actually dealing with this in the first place. And it involves one finding from modern research that is so surprising that researchers who study this topic still find it remarkable every time they describe it. Today we are going into the full, honest, respectful, and occasionally genuinely surprising story of how ancient women managed menstruation before civilization arrived with its pads and its shame, and its peculiar insistence on pretending this wasn't happening. Let's go. Before we get to what ancient women did during their periods, we need to spend a moment on a finding that changes the entire scale and context of the question. Ancient women had dramatically fewer periods than modern women do. Not slightly fewer, not marginally fewer, dramatically, almost incomparably fewer. The difference is so large that it reframes the entire question of period management in the ancient world from a constant monthly challenge into something that happened significantly less frequently and under completely different life circumstances. Here is the specific number that puts this in perspective. A typical uterus today will shed its lining around 400 times over a lifetime. Hunter-gatherer women would typically do so fewer than 50 times. 400 versus 50. Modern women experience roughly 8 times as many periods across their lifetime as ancient women did. That gap is not a rounding error. It is a fundamental difference in the biological experience of being a menstruating human, produced by completely different life circumstances. Understanding why ancient women had so many fewer periods requires looking at 3 specific factors that operated simultaneously and that together produced a reproductive pattern almost unrecognizable by modern standards. The first factor was the age at which menstruation began. It is thought that menarche, the first period, occurred at the average age of 16 for ancient women rather than 12 today. The reason is body fat. Menstruation requires a minimum body fat percentage to begin and sustain. Ancient women engaged in daily physical activity, walking, foraging, carrying loads, processing food, and eating a diet with no refined sugars or processed calories. They were lean in a way that modern sedentary humans rarely are. That leanness pushed the onset of menstruation later, reducing the total number of years spent menstruating. The second factor was pregnancy. Ancient women became pregnant relatively quickly after their periods began, had multiple children across their reproductive years. Estimates suggest somewhere between 4 and 6 live births. And each pregnancy represented 9 months of no periods. The pregnancies came more frequently and with shorter gaps between them than is typical in modern societies where contraception is available and where many people choose to have 1 or 2 children or none at all. The third factor, and this is the most powerful one, was breastfeeding. Studies of modern tribespeople with hunter-gatherer lifestyles show that fertile women have a median of 2 menstrual cycles per year, and just over 100 per lifetime. The mechanism behind this is lactational amenorrhea, the suppression of ovulation and menstruation by the hormonal signals of intensive breastfeeding. After giving birth, a mother would breastfeed for 3 or 4 years at more frequent intervals than modern day, allowing lactational amenorrhea to occur. Women in hunter-gatherer societies were likely to be pregnant, or if caring for an infant, in a state of lactational amenorrhea for most of their reproductive lives, and would consequently experience fewer menstrual cycles. Fewer menstrual cycles is an understatement. Women in hunter-gatherer cultures and other societies without birth control average a total of 160 periods. And some estimates put the number even lower for the most traditional populations. Lack of contraception meant that pregnancy would follow soon after menstruation resumed. After giving birth, a mother would breastfeed for 3 or 4 years. When breastfeeding stopped and the cycle restarted, pregnancy typically followed again, halting the cycle once more. What this means practically is that an ancient woman spent the vast majority of her reproductive years either pregnant or breastfeeding. Her periods were not a monthly calendar event. They were a relatively rare occurrence, something that happened during the brief windows between pregnancies and the lactational amenorrhea that each pregnancy triggered. The entire management challenge was on a completely different scale than what modern women experience. Not 1 week out of every 4 across decades of reproductive life. A small fraction of that total spread across a lifetime. This context is essential for everything that follows, because the question of how ancient women managed periods before pads is partly answered before we even get to the materials by the simple fact that they were managing them much, much less frequently than we might assume. Now let's talk about what actually happened during those periods when they did occur, because the archaeological and anthropological evidence gives us a genuine picture that is more sophisticated and more practical than popular imagination tends to allow. The earliest records of period management suggest that women in the Stone Age had rudimentary pads made of leather and linen-wrapped moss and sand. This is a reasonable starting point, but deserves unpacking because the materials involved were not as crude as the description makes them sound, and understanding why requires knowing something about the specific properties of moss. Sphagnum moss, the type most commonly found in the environments that ancient humans inhabited across northern Europe, northern Asia, and parts of Africa, is one of the most absorbent natural materials that exists. It can hold up to 20 times its own weight in water. It contains natural antimicrobial compounds called sphagnol that inhibit the growth of bacteria. It is soft, it is compressible into convenient shapes, and it was available in essentially unlimited quantities in the wet environments where ancient human bands frequently camped near water sources. An ancient woman using sphagnum moss to manage her period was not making a desperate compromise with an inadequate material. She was using something that, on the specific metrics of absorption and antimicrobial protection, compares favorably to many manufactured products. The moss worked. It worked well enough that it was used as wound dressing by military field surgeons well into the 19th century, specifically because of its exceptional absorbency and natural antimicrobial properties. The same material that ancient women were using for period management was being used by modern doctors to dress battlefield wounds because it was genuinely one of the best absorbent materials available. That reframing matters. Ancient women were not suffering through their periods with materials that barely functioned. They were using the highest performing natural absorbent available in their landscape, selected through generations of accumulated practical knowledge about what worked and what didn't. Moss was not the only option. The range of materials that ancient women and their counterparts in various traditional cultures used is broader and more creative than most people realize. Soft animal skins, the inside surface of a finely processed hide, which ancient women were skilled at producing as part of the regular work of processing hunted animals, were another option. The inside surface of tanned hide is soft, flexible, and moderately absorbent. It could be folded and held in place using a simple tie arrangement of plant fiber or sinew. It could be cleaned and reused. It was a material that ancient women were producing regularly for clothing and carrying purposes anyway, meaning that period management didn't require any separate craft knowledge. It required repurposing a familiar material in a straightforward way. Ancient equatorial African women used grass mats and rolled up grass to absorb blood. Dried grass, tightly rolled or bundled, has reasonable absorptive properties and was universally available across the savanna environments where our species spent most of its evolutionary history. The rolling technique, Compressing material into a dense form that held its shape and could be positioned effectively represents exactly the kind of practical problem solving that ancient women applied to this challenge. Certain plant fibers processed through pounding or soaking became soft and highly absorbent. The same plant processing techniques that ancient humans used to prepare fibers for rope and basketry could be applied to producing soft, absorbent pads from plants that were already part of the community's resource base. Ancient women who knew how to process plant fibers, and the evidence suggests that fiber processing was an ancient and sophisticated skill, had access to a range of materials whose absorbency depended on how they were prepared rather than on the raw plant alone. Water was also simply an option. Ancient women living near rivers and streams, which most did, given that water access was non-negotiable for survival, could wade into shallow water to manage flow, could rinse materials repeatedly, could use water immersion itself as a management strategy. The modern insistence on a sealed, hygienic containment system that can be worn in all situations without any exposure was not the only possible approach to period management. In a world where water access was daily and physical modesty norms were different from modern industrial society, water was a resource for period management rather than a complication. Here is something that the available evidence makes genuinely clear and that deserves to be stated directly. The concept of simply free bleeding, allowing flow without active containment, was almost certainly common in the ancient world, and the social context of ancient life made this significantly less of a practical problem than modern instincts suggest. Ancient women were not wearing tailored garments with complex construction that would be difficult to clean or replace. They were wearing animal skins draped or tied around the body, or in warmer climates minimal, or no covering at all. The practical consequences of free bleeding with minimal clothing in a warm outdoor environment are dramatically different from the practical consequences of free bleeding in a modern office while wearing business casual clothing. Ancient life involved regular physical exertion, regular exposure to natural environments, regular engagement with water sources, and clothing that was simple enough to be washed by beating in a stream or replaced without significant material cost. The entire framework within which period management needed to operate was completely different from the modern context. The urgency of absolute containment. The modern expectation that no trace of menstruation should be visible or detectable under any circumstances was not the standard that ancient women were working against. This doesn't mean ancient women were indifferent to managing their periods or that they simply ignored the situation. It means the practical requirements of management were different, and the solutions they developed were appropriate to those requirements rather than to the requirements of modern life. Now, here is one of the most genuinely surprising aspects of this entire topic, and it comes from an angle that almost nobody considers when they think about ancient period management. The menstrual blood itself was understood differently. In multiple ancient and traditional cultures, menstrual blood was not simply waste to be contained and hidden. It was a substance with perceived power, significance, and occasionally ritualistic importance. The blood would also form part of ceremonies and rituals, like the spring festivals when they would spread it on the earth to increase fertility. This is completely foreign to the modern framework that treats menstruation as a hygienic inconvenience to be managed invisibly. But it reflects something important about the relationship ancient humans had with biological processes generally. A relationship in which the body's outputs were embedded in a spiritual and communal framework rather than being purely private and purely practical. Archaeological evidence from multiple ancient sites includes ochre, the red iron oxide mineral that ancient humans used extensively for body decoration, art, and apparently some hygienic purposes, in contexts that some researchers have suggested may relate to menstruation. The consistent use of red pigment in ancient ritual contexts and the association between red ochre and female symbolism in several ancient cultures has led some scholars to propose that menstruation held a specific cultural significance in ancient human communities that has been largely lost from the historical record. We cannot know with certainty what ancient women's cultural experience of menstruation was like. The evidence is insufficient for confident claims. But the cross-cultural pattern of menstruation being embedded in spiritual and social frameworks in traditional societies, rather than being purely private and invisible, suggests that the ancient relationship with this biological process was fundamentally different from the modern industrial one in ways that went beyond just the materials used for management. Let's talk about pain. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3 plus hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Because period management is not only about containment, it is also about the physical experience of menstruation itself and the cramps, fatigue, and discomfort that accompany it for many women. Ancient women had access to plant medicine with genuine pharmacological activity against the specific symptoms of menstruation. This was not folk superstition or placebo. The knowledge of which plants affected pain, which reduced cramping, which had anti-inflammatory properties, was accumulated across generations of women observing the effects of plants on their own bodies and transmitting that knowledge to the next generation. Several plants with documented effects on menstrual symptoms were available in the environments that ancient humans inhabited. Yarrow, a plant found across Europe, Asia, and Africa, contains compounds with genuine anti-inflammatory and antispasmodic properties. It has been documented as a traditional remedy for menstrual cramps across multiple cultures on different continents. Wild ginger contains gingerols and shogaols that have demonstrated effectiveness for reducing menstrual pain in modern clinical studies, and wild ginger species were present across the tropical environments where ancient humans lived. The hot compress, the modern equivalent of putting a heating pad on your abdomen for cramps, was available to ancient women in a simple form: a stone heated by fire and wrapped in soft material applied to the abdomen. Heat therapy for menstrual cramps does not require modern technology. It requires fire and a stone, both of which were fundamental features of ancient human daily life. Ancient women with access to accumulated plant knowledge and to fire were not without any resources for managing the physical symptoms of menstruation. They had a pharmacopoeia built from generations of observation and a simple heat therapy that is as effective in its mechanism now as it was then. The experience was certainly harder than the modern equivalent, but it was not without any tools at all. Here is the social dimension of ancient period management that tends to get overlooked entirely, and it matters more than most people realize. Ancient women were not managing their periods alone. They were embedded in small, tight-knit communities in which the women knew each other's reproductive status. This was impossible to hide in a group of 30 people living in constant close proximity. Older women who had been through more reproductive cycles had more experience. Younger women learned from older ones. The knowledge of what worked, which plants to use, which materials were most effective, how to manage the physical symptoms, what the experience was going to be like, was transmitted directly between women who knew each other well and who had both practical experience and genuine investment in helping each other manage. This transmission of menstrual knowledge between women is one of the oldest forms of female community knowledge sharing in human history. It didn't require writing. It didn't require formal institutions. It required older women who knew things and younger women who needed to know them and a social context. The small band of people who lived together and knew each other's lives in intimate detail that made that transmission natural and continuous. The community that ancient women navigated their periods within was not indifferent to the experience. It was a group of people who shared resources, shared knowledge, and, in the case of the female members, shared the specific biological experience of menstruation across their reproductive lives. The social support for managing this experience was built into the structure of ancient community life in ways that modern individualistic societies have, in some respects, dismantled. Here is the perspective that all of this research builds toward, and it is worth stating clearly. Ancient women managed their periods with a combination of factors that modern assumptions completely miss. They had dramatically fewer periods than modern women, perhaps 50 across a lifetime compared to 400, which changes the entire scale of the management challenge. They had access to natural materials, particularly sphagnum moss, that were genuinely high-performing for absorbency and antimicrobial protection. They had plant medicine with real pharmacological activity against menstrual symptoms. They had fire for heat therapy. They had community knowledge transmitted between women across generations. And they operated within a social and cultural framework that related to menstruation differently than the shame-laden modern industrial framework that replaced it. Was it harder than the modern experience? Yes, unambiguously. The absence of convenient, disposable, precisely calibrated modern period products made management more effortful. The absence of effective pharmaceutical pain relief made the physical symptoms harder. The absence of privacy made everything more socially exposed. None of that should be minimized. But ancient women were not helpless. They were not simply suffering through an experience with no resources and no knowledge and no community support. They were managing a biological reality that they had fewer annual encounters with than modern women do, using the best materials their environment provided, with knowledge built over thousands of years of women learning from other women in communities where biological processes were part of shared life rather than private shame. The pad was not the beginning of period management. It was the most recent chapter in a story that started hundreds of thousands of years ago with a woman reaching for something soft and absorbent and sensible and doing what needed to be done. Just like always.